Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to your first official day of new learning. So, what we're going to do is have the lecture that we didn't get to have before we all got dismissed from school. So, the last thing that we were talking about and what you guys should be turning in, you still need to turn in the Unit 3 project. Are you hearing me? Are you hearing? Do I need to get closer to the microphone? So you still need to turn that in because I can still grade it. Because you did all this hard work and I want to see what you've come up with. You guys had such great topics. I would hate for it to completely go to waste. So, after this lecture and after you turn in your projects to me, I need them by Tuesday when I see you guys again. We'll be finished with colonialism and get to move on to one of the topics that I absolutely love to talk about when it comes to Latin America. But first, we have to set up for it. So, one of the last pieces that we talked about before we left was the impact of exploration on Latin America. So, we talked about the loss of life, we talked about the loss of culture, we talked about those pesky explorers that came poking their noses where it shouldn't have belonged. Well, let's talk about after that. So they're here, they've set up shop. So what happens next? And what happens next is colonialism. We experience that here in the US. You guys have been taught that since, you were younger. But what does that look like when it comes to Latin America? Well, let's find out. And I like to start with a video that I absolutely enjoy. It is by Eddie Izzard talking about how the British Empire was able to conquer so many countries. So we're going to start off by watching this really fast.
We built up empires. We stole countries. That's what you do. That's how you build an empire. We stole countries with the cunning use of flags. Yeah. You just sail around the world and stick a flag in. I claim India for Britain. And they go, you can't claim us. We live here. 500 million of us. Do you have a flag? We don't need a bloody flag. It's our country, you bastard. No flag, no country. You can't have one. That's the rules that I've just made up. And I'm backing it up with this gun that was lent from the National Rifle Association.
Okay, so you can see how the argument for exploration was pretty dumb. Like, basically, if there was no civilized system in place, then the Europeans just came and took it for themselves. So they stuck their flag in the ground saying, I claim this land in the name of His Majesty. And it's actually still happening today. So the cartoon that you see here are the explorers on one side and the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. And that guy is saying, I structurally adjust this land in the name of economic growth. And we will talk about that in a couple of units to come, what that really means. All right. So, the discovery of the New World had a major impact, not just on what happened in the Americas, but also what happened in Europe. It had a profound impact on Europe, politically, economically, and socially. At this point in time in Europe, if you guys remember from world history, Europe was kind of fighting over who was the best country, and they were lacking resources. They needed to open up those trade routes into Europe to see who could obtain those products and then come back and sell them, right? That's how you make money. So politically, how this worked is it gave bragging rights to those in charge, aka the kings and queens of Europe. So they now had bragging rights that they opened up into this new world, this new territory. Economically, what that did is it introduced completely different products to Europe, which made them extremely valuable. And then you also had gold and diamonds and jade and precious materials that all of the monarchs loved and, loved to, show off with. Socially, this had a profound impact because if you were not a wealthy person in Europe coming to the Americas, you could return to Europe with a small fortune and it would change your station in Europe and then ultimately in Latin America as well. And it also provided a different view of the world for a lot of Europeans. So to them, the world was like this big, right? It was tiny. And then all of a sudden, by finding the new world, it did this number. We already knew that the world was large, but now it was even larger than it was before. Um, we have seen this before. We have talked about this before. I've showed this to you. This was the colonial social structure. This is how colonial society was laid out. You had the Peninsulares, the Creoles, the Mestizos, the Mulattoes, the Africans, the Native Americans. And we talked about why the Native Americans were at the bottom of this list is because they weren't like most of them died. And Africans were there to be the labor. They were there to work. So, yeah, it's not right. I can't justify this system whatsoever, but this is the one that Europe brought with them into Latin America. And this is the one that developed. So, just as a refresher, Peninsulares are those who were born in the Iberian Peninsula, aka Portugal or Spain. Creoles or Creoles were those who were 100% of European descent but born in the Americas. Mestizos are Europe's natives. Mulattoes are Europe's and Africans. And then, yeah. So, how this plays into the colonial administration is kind of unique because you have Europeans who are essentially controlling the systems in the way Latin America is governed. So at the very top of that, you have the peninsulares. Spain used governors to control the colonies and carry out new mandates. So they use these peninsulares as the governors because they were European. They were born in Spain. They were born in Portugal. So they were trustworthy because they were very much loyal to the crown. You couldn't really trust somebody who calls themselves Spanish but has never seen Spain. So the Creoles had symbolic positions of power. Symbolic, meaning that they were just there to kind of look pretty. They didn't really have any authority, even though they considered themselves Spanish. They didn't consider themselves American. To them, they were 100% Spanish. So they had some power, but it was just for show. They didn't really hold any power because that was with the Peninsulares. And this plays a very big deal in our next unit when we talk about revolutions. Also, what Spain brought with them is our first look into this plantation system. So, to Spain or in Latin America, it was called the encomiendas. So, it was a plantation. You had the big house, you had a church, you had a small camp for workers to live in, and there was no blending of the two. If you worked in the fields, you stayed in your own camp. If you were a Creole or a Peninsule, you lived in the big house or within the town limits. I'm just saying, it's not a pretty system, but that's the way that it was. So every place had a manager, the incomi I can't pronounce it. You guys know this. Um, so you had a person in charge, which is the manager of the encomienda system, and it was like a small city that was set up. You had fortifications on the coast. You had the town itself, which is where all of the Spaniards lived. Everything was built around a church because to the Spanish, the Catholic Church is the way of life. So you had a monastery, you had a church, and it was a city in itself. And then in the background, you actually see here, you see that there is a temple for the Aztecs. These are mostly lost today, all of the temples. They're still finding Mayan temples throughout all of the jungle of Mexico and Central America because they didn't know they were there. They lost them. Lost giant pyramids. It's because people no longer live in these places. They lived in cities like this. It's sad. It really is sad. We have all seen this. We studied it right before we left. We know this is the Columbian Exchange, and we know the Columbian Exchange was the exchange of goods, diseases, and people between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But what we didn't take a look at is this. So this is a image, a map of what is mercantilism. So during this time, we saw the emergence of a new economic system called mercantilism, and it's the main economic system pretty much from this point forward until we have the Industrial Revolution, and that's when we have capitalism, which there's not a lot of difference between mercantilism and capitalism. I'm just going to throw that out there. Mercantilism is this whole idea that you became profitable from trading, aka commercialism. So I have this good, and you would like this good, so you're going to pay me money for this good. That's all mercantilism is just the exchange of goods and becoming profitable from it. It's pretty much what we have today, except we don't call it mercantilism because merchants are not selling it like they did back then. Merchants were a specialized class. Now, like, you have Walmart and Target who are vying over the same products. So this system is also how the monarchs in the countries of Europe kind of based their wealth on how much territory of the world they controlled, because how much territory of the world they controlled meant they had a variety of products. This became crucial with Spain because they controlled a majority of the New World at this time, and that meant that they had a majority control of gold, silver. They had tobacco, they had sugar, they had a laundry list of stuff that they specifically controlled, whereas nobody else did. So their wealth was way up here, and it got to their heads because they ended up spending all of it, getting into wars they couldn't fight. So they ended up losing a lot of their money and a lot of their wealth, and in the end had to sign away a lot of their colonial holdings because they had more money than they had sense. That's essentially what happened. So 80% of the colonial economy was based on agriculture and ranching. Makes perfect sense because you have these encomienda systems. Mining also became an essential part of all of this because you were mining for gold and silver and other precious metals that were only around in Latin America. You also started to see them mine for other minerals like, jade, or turquoise, other rare materials that were specific to Latin America. Maybe not jade. I was thinking of turquoise. I don't know why I said that. So then you saw the emergence of this commercial enterprise really blow up. So that is where you start to see the exchange of manufactured goods for raw materials. So the triangular trade, right? You saw this right up here. We all know this. You drew it in, right? So this caused Latin America to become dependent on Europe because every raw good, every raw material that they were taking out of their ground, they would have to send back to Europe, and Europe would manufacture them and then resell them to the colonies. Man, Europe is making a killing at this time. Because not only are they getting these raw materials for free, right? Like it's theirs, they claimed it, they're also forcing you to buy it back for them. Who thought up that one? So, because of all of this and the way colonialism was set up or colonization was set up in Latin America, there were significant changes that were coming their way in the 18th century. So, you started to see these piecemeal reforms. So, the Creoles were becoming antsy. They realized they had no power and they wanted power. So they demanded power. So they were given some. The Peninsulares were not going to give up their power for anything, and Spain and Portugal were not going to release their control over it. So they were at least granted a seat at the table, but Peninsulares still controlled literally everything. Also, Creoles were becoming ever suspicious of their slaves. And so were the Peninsulares, because the slaves started to outnumber them. There were more slaves. There were 5 times more slaves than Peninsulares and Creoles in Latin America. Brazil became the main hub for the importation of slaves. I think the number is like 11 million slaves were brought into Brazil during this time period. So this is where we start to see the introduction of slave laws, which greatly restricted the movement of slaves. And it also greatly restricted their basic human rights. This is where you started to see them be beaten and tortured and, just living in the fear of the whim of their owners. Insane. And that would come back to bite them in the tail, because during the Enlightenment, we know that John Locke advocated for those natural rights of humans, which is not what's in the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence states that every man has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke's was actually life, liberty, and property. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that man was good and then made bad through his experiences. And then you had Hobbes, who had this Leviathan theory that men were bad and you had to make them good. So you had to basically punish them. You had to treat them as children. So all of these ideas combined, especially with Locke introducing his natural rights of, or the natural rights of humans, and then the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, had a profound impact on what would happen next in Latin America, because you saw some of the most significant leaders emerge from the Creole class. And that would be these two gentlemen that you see on your screen right now. That would be Simon Bolivar and Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint would come first, and then Simon Bolivar would help the rest of mainland South America, um, demand their independence. So, what does all of this have to do with the effects in Latin America? Well, we start to see a new culture emerge. And this new culture was pretty stinking awesome, if I have to say so myself, because you started to see the blending of Europe, or the European and native cultures together. So you saw a lot of bad, but you also saw some very interesting things pop up out of this. So let's, talk about the obvious. So there were new social standards were enacted, which means you had to dress, walk, talk, live like the Europeans. It's not right, but that's what it is. New religions were put in place, aka Catholicism became the religion of Latin America. You had this new social order, that was based on the patriarchy. Before this, societies were built on, what everybody could contribute, right? But this one became much more focused on gender roles. Men dominated society and women were the caregivers. So that also meant that you had a new social order, which we're going to talk about right now. So this is the social order that emerged. This is actually a painting of Spanish social order in Latin America. And if you start to look through each of these, you can see a different relationship emerge. You have what looks like to be a European with a native woman, and they have a child. You have two Europeans, in a child, and so on and so forth as you go down and you have African with African or African with Native. And each of these meant that you were in some sort of social order. Because if you notice in the corner of each, there is a number. Oh yeah, they got very specific with their social classes, especially after slave laws were enacted. So take a minute, pause this video, and actually really look at this because it is a little disturbing that people felt this way. One of the things that I absolutely find interesting about this whole time period, the blending of cultures, is the fact that voodoo was introduced. I am obsessed with voodoo. I love voodoo so much, but it has a stigma to it that is kind of unfair. All right, so voodoo, first and foremost, originated in Africa and was brought to the Americas. Shocker, through the slave trade. And it's a combination of African, Catholic, and Native traditions. So it's all of these things blended into one sort of religion. It's more so a lifestyle than it is a religion, but it's centered on the ideas of honor and respect. Respect to God, to the spirits, to the family, and to also oneself. This isn't this isn't different than paganism or what's considered witchcraft based off of paganism. It's very similar. It's not a cult. That's supposed to be cult. I don't know what that is. I'll change it later. Um, it's not based on black magic or devil worship. There are no witch doctors or sorcerers because it is a lifestyle that requires your individual experience mixed with empowerment and a responsibility that you are going to do good, not bad, and you are going to help people and you are going to honor and respect those around you. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. Voodoo is found in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and then it's found in parts of Cuba, the United States, New Orleans. Hello, that's awesome. You have France and also Montreal, and any other places that saw a significant Haitian immigrant population. I have uploaded this video on Canvas, or this PowerPoint on Canvas. So I actually encourage you to go and watch this Haitian voodoo video. It is interesting how voodoo was set up in Haiti and what it looks like and what they actually do. It looks crazy and it looks creepy, but everything they do has an amazing, not result. It's has an amazing power behind it, like the belief system. um they are doing weird things, it looks like, but everything they do in voodoo has a purpose, and it is extremely interesting. I highly recommend watching that video. So what this all comes down to is, what are the consequences of exploration and colonization? Well, I can answer those for you. So the effects are this. We got to talk about the bad. First, you have this deep seated issues with race and racial inequality. We looked at this at the beginning of the semester when we talked about colorism. Colorism is still very much found in Latin America. We had this conversation. It is still something that they fight with today, and it's based off of this social hierarchy that the Spanish came in and put in place. You know, I can look at you right now and tell you that everybody is different. We're not all built the same, but they meaning Spaniards and the Portuguese, put an emphasis on how white you were, how light your skin color was. If your skin color was light, then you had a higher station in life. Case in point, in Brazil, with the first, queen of Brazil. Remember the beauty pageant that we looked at? She was the first one that looked like the majority of the population in Brazil, but they took her crown away from her. But You also have deep seated divisions between the rich and the poor. This is very much evident to this day, even in Latin America. Still haven't quite recovered from that one. And they also haven't quite recovered from the deep divisions between gender roles or genders, period. In a lot of Latin American countries, females only go to school up until a certain age because then it is your turn to stay at home and help take care of things while the boys continue on in their education. Yeah, that still happens in the world today. Some of the good effects, though, you have this new language that emerges. So, we talked about earlier in the semester also the fact that Spanish isn't the same where you go. You have the academic Spanish, which is taken from Spain, but each individual country in Latin America has their own version of Spanish. And I called it Spanish slang, but what linguists have actually seen is that a lot of this slang is taken from the original natives, their language, and blended with the Spanish, which is absolutely fascinating to me because I love language and I love accents and understanding where they came from. So knowing that you if you know Spanish, you can understand all of it except for a few words that may be different or may not have the same meaning. And sometimes though that's the result of the blending of the native tongue with the Spanish language. Very, very interesting. So that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed. Please go to assignments and complete the assignments there. And I will see you guys in a little bit. Bye.